dimensions that we're able to derive from this image is conclusive. The length on this ship is about 258 to 259 meters as we can measure it in length.
For more than 8 decades, the pride of the Kido Butai rested nearly 3 miles beneath the ocean, sealed in absolute darkness.
We are surveying an entire battlefield. This is one of the largest battles of World War II.
Then, in September 2023, a remotely operated vehicle slipped down to her grave and revealed images unseen since 1942. Her anti-aircraft guns remain frozen, aimed skyward. The Imperial chrysanthemum still crowns the bow.
When you see these wrecks on the bottom of the ocean and everything, you kind of get a feel for what the real price is for war. You see the damage these things took, and you know, it's humbling to watch.
And etched into the wreck is the story of 5 brutal minutes that reshaped the war. This was the ship that ignited the Pacific conflict, and this is how it met its end. Akagi, the warship that refused to die until it did. For more than 8 decades, the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi existed only in battle reports, survivor testimony, and grainy wartime photographs. She had vanished beneath nearly 3.5 miles of Pacific water into a realm where pressure crushes steel and sunlight has never reached. At that depth, over 500 atmospheres, no human diver could survive, and no conventional submarine could reach her. The flagship that helped ignite the Pacific War had simply disappeared, sealed away in darkness. That changed in September 2023. A remotely operated vehicle descended more than 17,000 feet through black, freezing water, guided only by sonar and instruments. When the cameras finally switched on, historians were confronted with something extraordinary. Akagi lay on the seabed almost upright, resting on her keel as if she had settled there deliberately. The Imperial chrysanthemum crest, symbol of the Emperor himself, remained visible on her bow. This was not a scattered debris field. This was a ship paused in the final seconds of her life. High-frequency sonar images reveal a massive hull broken in places, surrounded by debris, yet astonishingly intact for a vessel that had burned for hours before sinking. The scars on her structure tell a story that aligns uncannily well with wartime records. "She's sitting upright on her keel," expedition leader Robert Kraft explained. "We can see the bow, the stern, gun emplacements, and sections where the flight deck has been torn away, allowing us to look directly into the hangar spaces below. The dimensions are conclusive. This can be none other than Akagi." Between September 8 and 12, 2023, a joint United States and Japanese research team operating under the direction of the Ocean Exploration Trust conducted the survey aboard a deep-sea research vessel. For the first time since 1942, the world could see how Akagi truly met her end. The footage offers historians something they have never had before: direct visual evidence of the ship's final condition. But to understand why these images matter so deeply, it isn't enough to focus on her death. You have to understand what Akagi was meant to be, what she became, and what Japan lost when she went down. Akagi was never supposed to be an aircraft carrier. Her keel was laid at the Kure Naval Arsenal on December 6, 1920, as part of Japan's ambitious Amagi-class battlecruiser program. At the time, Japan was locked in a high-stakes naval arms race with the United States and Britain. Battleships and battlecruisers were still considered the ultimate symbols of power, and Akagi was designed to be one of them. Fast, heavily armed, and capable of standing in the line of battle. Then history intervened. 2 years later, Japan signed the Washington Naval Treaty, which imposed strict limits on battleship and battlecruiser construction. Under the treaty's terms, Akagi should have been scrapped where she stood, but buried in the fine print was a loophole. Each signatory nation could convert 2 unfinished capital ships into aircraft carriers of limited displacement. Japan seized the opportunity. The incomplete hulls of Akagi and her sister ship Amagi were selected for conversion. It was a radical decision at the time. Aircraft carriers were still experimental platforms, their role in naval warfare far from settled. Japan had already commissioned its first carrier, Hosho, but Akagi was something else entirely, larger, faster, and intended to operate alongside the main battle fleet. Fate struck again on September 1, 1923, when the Great Kanto earthquake devastated the Tokyo region. Amagi's hull was twisted and damaged beyond any economically feasible repair and was scrapped. Akagi, improbably, survived. From the very beginning, she seemed to defy destruction. Construction as an aircraft carrier officially began in November of the same year. The Japanese didn't waste any time to upgrade the one that had miraculously survived an earthquake. Akagi was launched in April 1925 and commissioned in March 1927. By the time she entered service, she was the second aircraft carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy and one of the most imposing warships afloat. Her name followed tradition. Capital ships originally intended as battle cruisers were named after mountains, and Akagi took her name from Mount Akagi, a dormant volcano in the Kanto region. Even after her conversion to a carrier, the mountain name remained, a subtle reminder of the ship she was originally meant to be. Physically, Akagi was enormous for her era. She measured over 261 meters in length, displaced more than 34,000 tons at a full load, and carried a crew of roughly 1,600 men. Her speed, over 31 knots, allowed her to keep pace with cruisers and battleships alike. Her internal layout reflected the experimental nature of early carrier design. Akagi featured 2 main hangar decks and a 3rd auxiliary hangar below them. Aircraft could be launched directly from lower flight decks while landings occurred above, a concept intended to increase operational tempo, but one that introduced serious complications. The enclosed hangars, vast and fuel-filled, were effectively sealed steel boxes. Once a fire started inside them, it had nowhere to go. She carried no catapults. Aircraft were launched using the ship's forward momentum and the length of the deck alone. Elevators moved planes between hangars and flight deck, but their placement, especially the offset forward lift, was a compromise forced by the original battlecruiser hull. Akagi's designers were also unwilling to fully abandon old naval thinking. She carried 10 massive 20-centimeter guns, weapons more suited to a cruiser than a carrier. The idea was simple. If surprised by enemy surface ships, Akagi could fight back. In practice, those guns added weight, complexity, and vulnerability. They offered little real protection and underscored how uncertain carrier doctrine still was in the 1920s. Her anti-aircraft defenses were similarly compromised. Many of her guns were mounted on sponsons below the flight deck, positioned so they could only fire to their own side of the ship. They could not fire across the deck, leaving gaps in coverage. Aviation fuel tanks were integrated directly into the hull structure, meaning shock and vibration were transmitted straight into volatile fuel storage. Combined with enclosed hangars and limited firefighting capability, Akagi carried the seeds of her own destruction from the day she was commissioned. Yet despite these flaws, Akagi became the heart of Japan's carrier force. She served as flagship of the Kido Butai, the powerful carrier strike group that redefined naval warfare. From Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, Akagi represented a new way of fighting at sea, one where aircraft, not guns, decided battles. That legacy makes her end all the more tragic. When Akagi was crippled at Midway, fire spread through her hangars with terrifying speed. So, how did it come to this for Japan's flagship? Battle of Midway, Japan's invincible fleet. In early 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy still clung to old assumptions. Aircraft carriers were important, yes, but they were meant to support battleships, not replace them. Fleet doctrine scattered carriers across formations, treating them as auxiliaries rather than the centerpiece of naval power. That thinking didn't survive contact with reality. A small group of forward-thinking officers rejected it outright. Instead of dispersing carriers, they proposed something radical: concentration. Every fleet carrier Japan possessed would operate together as a single, overwhelming striking force. All air power focused into one blow. That force became known as the Kido Butai, the Mobile Force, and nothing like it had ever existed. At its heart stood Akagi, designated flagship. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo took command. Nagumo was a torpedo specialist, not an aviator, and critics quietly questioned whether he truly understood carrier warfare. But he was senior, disciplined, and widely respected. From Akagi's bridge, he would direct operations across thousands of miles of ocean. By late 1941, the Kido Butai was a floating paradox, built on revolutionary ideas but commanded by men still learning what those ideas meant in practice. Alongside Akagi sailed Kaga, the fast carriers Hiryu and Soryu, and later the modern Shokaku and Zuikaku. 6 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, an entire nation's offensive power packed onto a handful of flight decks. In November 1941, that force vanished. The carriers assembled at remote Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, far from prying eyes. On November 22, senior commanders gathered aboard Akagi for a final briefing. A detailed diorama of Pearl Harbor filled the room. Battleships neatly labeled, airfields marked, fuel tanks highlighted. 4 days later, the fleet slipped into the North Pacific under absolute radio silence. Transmitter keys were physically removed from every ship. For nearly 2 weeks, the carriers drove eastward through winter storms that battered crews but concealed their approach. On December 2nd, a coded message arrived from Tokyo. Nitakayama, Nobore. Climb Mount Nitaka. The attack was on. Before dawn on December 7, Akagi turned into the wind. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida launched first, followed by 183 aircraft from all 6 carriers. At 7:49 in the morning, his signal crackled through the airwaves. Tora! 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 Complete surprise achieved. Torpedo bombers skimmed low over Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned, capsized, or sank at their moorings. 8 were damaged or destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. And yet, even in victory, a critical choice was made. Fuchida urged a third strike. Fuel depots were untouched. Repair facilities still stood. One more wave could cripple America's ability to respond. Nagumo refused. The American carriers were missing, and every passing hour increased the risk of counterattack. The decision, made on Akagi's bridge, would echo through the entire war. For 6 months afterward, Japan seemed unstoppable. Rabaul fell. Darwin was bombed. The Indian Ocean raids shattered Allied confidence. Akagi was present for nearly every triumph. To many, the ship appeared invincible. But Isoroku Yamamoto knew better. Japan could not win a long war. American industrial power dwarfed Japan's, and time favored the enemy. The only hope was to force a decisive battle that destroyed the United States carrier strength in one stroke. Yamamoto chose the Battle of Midway, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. When the Americans came to defend it, the Kido Butai would annihilate them. What Yamamoto did not know was that American codebreakers had already unraveled Japan's plans. 3 United States carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, sailed quietly to intercept. The trap was set. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, Nagumo launched 180 aircraft from 4 carriers toward Midway Island. Akagi contributed dive bombers and Zero fighters. Back aboard the flagship, reserve torpedo bombers waited in the hangars, armed, fueled, and ready to strike any American ships that appeared. Throughout the morning, American aircraft from Midway attacked in waves. They were brave and slaughtered. Torpedo planes were torn apart. Bombers were shot down. One damaged B-26 flew so low over Akagi's bridge that officers briefly saw the pilot's face before it crashed into the sea. The Kido Butai remained untouched. Then came the moment that decided everything. Nagumo's strike leader radioed that Midway needed a second attack. The reserve aircraft, however, were armed with torpedoes for ship attacks. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo ordered them rearmed with bombs. 13 minutes later, a scout plane reported American ships to the northeast. Nagumo reversed the order. Bombs off, torpedoes back on. The hangar decks descended into controlled chaos. Ordnance stacked beside aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks. Bombs and torpedoes lay unsecured, with no time to return them to magazines. At 8:20 a.m., the scout confirmed what Nagumo feared most. The American force included carriers. He still could not strike immediately, an inability that crippled the Japanese. The 5 minutes that broke the empire. By mid-morning on June 4, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was trapped by time itself. His first strike against Midway was returning, aircraft low on fuel and ammunition, pilots exhausted. They had to be recovered. There was no choice. Only after they landed could he launch a counterstrike against the American carriers now known to be nearby. It was during this narrow 5 fatal minutes window that the Americans arrived. One after another, United States torpedo squadrons hurled themselves at the Japanese fleet. First came Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet, then Torpedo 6 from USS Enterprise. Finally, Torpedo 3 from USS Yorktown. 41 aircraft in total, slow, vulnerable TBD devastators flying straight and low over open water. They never stood a chance. Japanese Zero fighters descended on them like hawks. Anti-aircraft fire stitched the sea. One squadron after another was annihilated. 35 aircraft were destroyed. Not a single torpedo found its mark. It was a massacre, and yet those doomed attacks changed everything. The Zeros were dragged down to sea level. Anti-aircraft gunners tracked low, fast targets skimming the waves. Eyes were locked downward. No one was looking up. At 10:20 a.m., 28 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise suddenly appeared high overhead, perfectly positioned out of the sun. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey tipped his aircraft over and began his dive. Below him, the Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable. Flight decks cluttered, hangars packed with aircraft. Fuel hoses snaked across steel decks. Bombs and torpedoes lay stacked beside planes as crews rushed to reverse armament orders issued, then rescinded, by Nagumo only minutes earlier. Most of McCluskey's group peeled off toward Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best noticed the error instantly. He banked hard toward the flagship, Akagi. Only 2 wingmen followed him, 3 dive bombers against the most powerful carrier in the Pacific. Best held his dive longer than doctrine allowed. Longer than instinct begged him to. At 10:26 a.m., he released his bomb. It struck the aft edge of Akagi's middle elevator and detonated inside the upper hangar. Below the deck sat 18 torpedo bombers, fully armed, fully fueled, parked amid stacks of ordnance hastily piled during the rearming chaos. The explosion ignited aviation fuel vapor, ruptured lines, and triggered secondary blasts that rolled through the enclosed hangar like a furnace. Akagi's design flaws did the rest. Fires had nowhere to escape. Heat built instantly. Fuel tanks cracked and bled gasoline into the inferno. One bomb was enough. Within minutes, Akagi was doomed. Nagumo stood motionless on the bridge, watching smoke boil upward through shattered decking. His flagship was burning from the inside out. Staff officers eventually convinced him to abandon ship. With ladders destroyed, he escaped through the bridge windows, lowered by rope to a waiting destroyer. Command of the fleet slipped away as the fire raged uncontrollably. Nearby, Kaga and Soryu were already blazing wrecks. Only Hiryu remained operational, and she struck back hard, launching attacks that crippled Yorktown. But the reprieve was brief. By evening, Hiryu too was mortally hit. 4 fleet carriers, Japan's finest, were destroyed within hours. Akagi burned through the afternoon, through the evening, and deep into the night. Firefighting efforts failed. Ammunition cooked off. Bulkheads warped. At 4:50 a.m. on June 5, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto issued the order he had dreaded. He noted that he had once commanded Akagi himself, and that it was with heartfelt regret he ordered her scuttled. 4 Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into her starboard side. At 5:20 a.m., Akagi slipped beneath the waves, bow first. Sailors aboard the escorting ships shouted banzai as she disappeared. 267 men went down with her. But Akagi's destruction was only part of a larger story. Earlier that morning, before the carrier-based torpedo squadrons had even arrived, another group of Americans had already demonstrated a kind of courage that stunned the Japanese. 4 United States Army Air Force's B-26 Marauder bombers took off from Midway Island on a near-suicidal mission. The aircraft were never designed for low-altitude torpedo attacks against warships, especially not against the most powerful fleet ever assembled. They went anyway. Among them was First Lieutenant James P. Murray, flying a B-36 nicknamed Susie Q. As the bombers descended to wave-top height, Zero fighters swarmed them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. 1 Marauder was destroyed before it could release its torpedo. Murray's aircraft was riddled with bullets. Crewmen were wounded. Controls were damaged. Still, he pressed on. Flying barely 20 feet above the sea, Murray released his torpedo at Akagi. It missed, but that was the attack that forced the carrier to maneuver sharply, eventually leaving it exposed. Instead of pulling away, Murray continued straight ahead, skimming the length of Akagi's flight deck. His gunners strafed the ship so closely that Japanese gunners hesitated to fire, fearing they would hit their own carrier. 2 men aboard Akagi were killed in the pass. Another Marauder, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays, nearly struck the bridge before crashing into the sea. Japanese officers, including Nagumo, later reported having to duck as American bombers roared overhead. The experience was deeply unsettling. Japanese doctrine held that Americans lacked the will for self-sacrifice. Watching enemy pilots apparently attempt to ram their flagship shattered that belief. Of the 4 Marauders, 2 were lost. Murray somehow limped back to Midway with over 500 bullet holes, a destroyed wheel, and damaged propellers. His crew survived. None of the torpedo attacks, Army or Navy, scored decisive hits. Nearly all the aircraft were destroyed. Yet their sacrifice achieved something far more important. They pulled fighters and guns down, cleared the sky above the fleet, and set the stage for the dive bombers that arrived minutes later. Within 5 minutes of the dauntless attack, the battle and the balance of the Pacific War had changed forever. Midway shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. It proved American resolve, bled Japan of irreplaceable pilots, and handed the initiative to the United States. The tide had turned, not gradually, but violently, in fire and steel. And at the center of it all burned Akagi, a flagship undone by courage from below, precision from above, and 5 minutes that rewrote history, history that would later be reopened. Into the Abyss, how Akagi was found after 81 years of silence. When the survivors of Midway returned home, they were ordered not to speak. Officially, Akagi was listed on naval registries for months afterward, not as sunk, but as unmanned. On paper, Japan's most famous carrier still existed. In reality, 4 fleet carriers were gone. The balance of the Pacific War had shifted in 5 violent minutes, and Akagi lay 3 miles beneath the ocean's surface in absolute darkness. And there she would remain. For decades, no one knew exactly where Akagi rested. The coordinates recorded at the time of her scuttling were vague, marked down during chaos, smoke, and retreat. The destroyers that fired the torpedoes did so at night, under pressure, with little time for careful navigation. Japanese commanders knew roughly where their flagship had been lost, but roughly means nothing when you are searching an ocean measured in millions of square miles, especially when the target lies 17,000 feet down. At that depth, the pressure exceeds 500 atmospheres. Steel that is not purpose-built crumples like foil. The temperature hovers just above freezing. Sunlight has never reached that environment, not once in Earth's history. Akagi had fallen into a realm of permanent night, far beyond the reach of conventional exploration. Even elite technical divers can only descend a few hundred feet. Military submarines operate at depths counted in hundreds of meters, not thousands. Akagi lay deeper than almost any warship wreck ever discovered. She also lay within one of the most protected marine environments on the planet. The wreck site falls inside the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, the largest protected area in the United States and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Any attempt to reach her would require permits, international cooperation, meticulous planning, and technology that simply did not exist for most of the post-war era. For more than 70 years, Akagi was effectively unreachable. The breakthrough finally came in October 2019. The research vessel RV Petrel, funded by Vulcan Inc., a company founded by the late Paul Allen, had been methodically searching the Pacific for lost warships. Petrel carried autonomous underwater vehicles, robotic explorers capable of descending to extreme depths, sweeping the seafloor with advanced sonar, and returning with detailed acoustic maps. On October 18, 2019, the team located Kaga. 2 days later, sonar revealed another massive shape. It sat upright on the seabed. The proportions were unmistakable. Bow and stern were visible. Gun emplacements could be identified. The flight deck appeared torn open amidships. The acoustic image strongly suggested Akagi, but sonar is not photography. It shows shadows, contours, and mass, not fine detail. And there was a problem. Petrel's remotely operated vehicle had been damaged during the Kaga survey. There was no way to descend and visually confirm the wreck. Akagi had been found, but not yet seen. Still, the discovery mattered. It proved the ship was intact enough to recognize. It narrowed the search to precise coordinates, and it confirmed that even the deepest, most legendary wrecks could be located with patience and robotics. During the same period, Vulcan's team also announced the discovery of USS Hornet, nearly 17,500 feet down near the Solomon Islands. Hornet had launched the Doolittle raid, fought at Midway, and been lost at Santa Cruz. Like Akagi, she had gone down after being deliberately scuttled. Vulcan's project eventually located around 20 historically significant vessels, honoring Paul Allen's vision of preserving naval history before time and corrosion erased it forever. In 2023, the Ocean Exploration Trust launched a dedicated expedition to the Midway wreck sites. Their vessel was RV Nautilus, operated under the direction of Robert Ballard, the same explorer who discovered Titanic and Bismarck. Nautilus brought not just prestige, but the right tools for a task few ships on Earth could attempt. The expedition, named IJN Akagi, was planned as a 27-day deep-sea survey focused on the 3 carriers lost at Midway: Akagi, 66 Kaga, and Yorktown. Nautilus carried a fleet of remotely operated vehicles, including Hercules, Argus, and Atalanta, linked to the surface by fiber optic tethers. These vehicles could transmit high-definition video in real time, flood the abyss with light, hover with centimeter-level precision, and maneuver robotic arms for close inspection. Between September 8th and 12th, 2023, Nautilus conducted the deepest ROV dives in its history, over 16,000 feet down. The Akagi survey alone lasted 14 hours. More than 18 hours of video were recorded. Over 9,000 still images were extracted. For the first time since June 5, 1942, human eyes were looking directly at Akagi, and the world was watching with them. Through Nautilus's live telepresence system, the footage was streamed in real time. Over 100 experts from the United States and Japan participated remotely, analyzing details as they appeared on screen. Archaeologists from Tokyo University, Tokai University, and Tokyo University of Marine Science and Technology collaborated with American researchers. Families of sailors lost at Midway, Japanese and American alike, watched the final resting place of their relatives emerge from darkness. Then the lights revealed the bow. Rising slowly from the sediment was the unmistakable prow of Akagi, and there, still attached after more than 80 years underwater, was the Imperial chrysanthemum crest, 16 petals, the sacred symbol of the Japanese emperor. It was intact, recognizable, undeniable. This was not just wreckage, it was a time capsule, As the ROV moved along the hull, twin 127mm anti-aircraft guns came into view, still mounted on their sponsons below the flight deck. They were still angled upward, frozen in their final defensive posture. In Akagi's last moments, the gunners had been tracking targets overhead. The attack had come so suddenly that no one ever lowered the barrels again. The cameras continued forward, documenting the damage that killed her. The flight deck was torn open amidships, the destruction radiating outward from the middle elevator, exactly where Lieutenant Richard Best's bomb had struck. You could see directly into the space where the upper hangar once existed. A section aft showed catastrophic structural failure far beyond what a single bomb could cause. This was the chain reaction. Fuel fires, exploding ordnance, a ship tearing itself apart from the inside. The ROV also recorded the evidence of Akagi's execution. Holes in the starboard hull marked where torpedoes from her own escorting destroyers had struck. The wounds were unmistakable. Debris littered the seafloor around the wreck, sections torn away during the 3-mile descent. The sediment itself bore scars from the impact. Chief Scientist Daniel Wagner later described the survey as an unprecedented opportunity to document battle damage, sinking damage, and design features in extraordinary detail. Everything matched the historical record. The gun barrels still pointed skyward. The chrysanthemum still crowned the bow. The destruction still traced back to a single, catastrophic moment. 81 years in darkness had not erased Akagi's story. She still bore witness to the 5 minutes that destroyed her, and to the turning point of a war that reshaped the modern world. A grave in the deep, what Akagi still teaches us. The Akagi is not just a shipwreck. She is a grave, quiet, sealed, and heavy with memory. When she slipped beneath the Pacific on June 5, 1942, 267 Japanese sailors went down with her. Their remains are still there, somewhere within collapsed compartments, twisted steel corridors, and machinery frozen in its last moment of purpose. No headstones mark the spot. No footsteps ever reach the deck. Only darkness, pressure, and time. Many of those men never tried to escape. Engineers stayed at their stations. Damage control teams fought fires that could not be beaten. Others were trapped below decks as explosions buckled bulkheads and sealed escape routes in seconds. Their final decisions were made in heat, smoke, and confusion. Choices history rarely records, but which mattered immensely in the moment. Because of that, Akagi is protected under both American and international law as a war grave. She lies within the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, a vast and sacred marine reserve recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Nothing can be removed, nothing can be disturbed. The 2023 survey followed strict non-invasive protocols. The remotely operated vehicles observed, recorded, and moved on, never touching, never altering. Every dive began and ended with ceremonies honoring the dead, reflecting respect for native Hawaiian traditions, Japanese families, and American military customs alike. This was not exploration for spectacle, it was bearing witness. During the expedition, Japanese Minister Nomura spoke to the meaning of the moment. He noted that Japan and the United States were meeting again on the same Pacific waters where they once met in battle, but this time as allies and fellow researchers. That sentiment resonated far beyond the deck of the research vessel. As the live footage streamed around the world, messages poured in from descendants in Japan and the United States. Grandchildren of sailors lost aboard Akagi, great-grandchildren of American pilots who attacked her. For many, this was the first time they had ever known precisely where their relatives came to rest. The survey also revealed something unexpected: how well preserved the wreck remains. At over 3 miles deep, Akagi has been protected by her own isolation. No storms reach her. No fishing nets scrape her hull. No currents roll the debris across the seafloor. The cold and crushing pressure have created an unintentional museum, one that preserves history with unsettling clarity. But even this preservation is temporary. Eventually, corrosion will win. Steel will weaken. Decks will collapse. Akagi will slowly dissolve into rust and sediment. The 2023 expedition captured her just in time. While the guns still point skyward, while the flight deck damage still tells its story, while the Imperial chrysanthemum crest still marks the bow, 2 other Japanese carriers lost at Midway, Soryu and Hiryu, remain unfound, still waiting somewhere in the same impossible depths. Akagi, at least, is hidden no longer. Her loss meant far more than the sinking of a single ship. When Akagi went down, she took with her a massive portion of Japan's offensive power. In a single day at Battle of Midway, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed. That was roughly 2/3 of the carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. On paper, ships could be replaced. Steel could be forged, flight decks could be rebuilt. The men could not. The aircraft maintenance crews lost aboard those carriers represented years of specialized training that could not be rushed or replicated. The pilots lost at Midway, though fewer than wartime propaganda claimed, were veterans of Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and the Indian Ocean raids. They understood carrier warfare instinctively, in ways textbooks cannot teach. That institutional knowledge vanished with the Kido Butai, and Japanese naval aviation never truly recovered from it. From Midway onward, Japan fought on the defensive. The empire that once seemed unstoppable began to contract. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Island by island, the Americans advanced. The Japanese Navy fought with determination and sacrifice, but the strategic initiative had been lost in the 5 minutes when American dive bombers found Akagi's flight deck crowded with fuel hoses, armed aircraft, and stacked bombs. The ship that helped launch the Pacific War could not prevent its outcome. There is something deeply profound about what the expedition represents. The same ocean where sailors once tried to kill one another now hosted a joint scientific mission. Japanese archaeologists from 3 universities worked alongside American researchers. The footage was shared openly. Ceremonies honored the dead on both sides. Former enemies became collaborators. The Pacific, once a dividing line, became a bridge. The wreck of Akagi stands as a monument, not to victory or defeat, but to the real cost of war. Not statistics or strategy, but torn metal, scattered debris, and lives cut short. Technology has finally allowed us to see what previous generations could only imagine. The cameras showed the guns still raised, the damage still raw, the violence preserved in silence. Understanding war means understanding what it actually does. Akagi teaches that lesson to anyone willing to look, 3 miles down, in a grave no one can visit, except through the eyes of a robot and the weight of history. Please click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.